Some stories don't just entertain, they change the way you feel, think, and see life. Welcome to ZZ Stories.
Poor single dad walks out of prison and finds his 9-year-old daughter living in a freezing barn. He went away an innocent man, with nothing but a photograph and a promise to return. But what he found when he came back would shatter even the strongest heart. 4 years locked behind bars, 4 years of silence. And the little girl he once kissed goodnight, she now sleeps in rags, alone, forgotten, and afraid to speak. They thought prison was his punishment, but nothing could prepare him for what his daughter endured in his absence. Before we continue, tell us, where in the world are you tuning in from? We love seeing how far our stories travel. The rusty latch gave way under Robert's trembling fingers, and the barn door creaked open with a sound that seemed to echo through his very soul. The smell hit him first. Musty air thick with dampness, mixed with the acrid smoke from a pathetic fire struggling to provide warmth in the October chill. His eyes adjusted slowly to the dim interior, where weak rays of afternoon sunlight filtered through gaps in the rotting wooden walls. And there, in the far corner, on a pile of threadbare blankets, sat a small figure that made his heart stop. For a moment, Robert couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't process what he was seeing. The chubby-cheeked 5-year-old from his memories, the little girl with pigtails who used to run into his arms squealing "Daddy," had become a painfully thin 9-year-old with hollow eyes that held too much knowledge of the world's cruelty. Her once bright hair now hung in tangled strands around shoulders that seemed too narrow to carry the weight of what she'd endured. She wore clothes that were clearly hand-me-down, several sizes too large, hanging on her frame like empty sacks. Her small hands showed calluses, cuts that no child should have, evidence of work that should have been done by adults who cared enough to. When their eyes met across that cold, decrepit space, Robert saw a flicker of recognition that nearly brought him to his knees. "Daddy." The word came out as barely a whisper, as if she was afraid that speaking too loudly might make this vision disappear. The photograph in Robert's pocket, the one he'd carried through 4 years of hell, suddenly felt like a mockery. The happy child in that picture no longer existed. In her place sat a ghost, a shadow of the daughter he'd fought so hard to return to. "Yes," he whispered, his voice breaking as tears streamed down his face. "Daddy's here now." But Sophia didn't run to him as he'd imagined she would during countless sleepless nights in his cell. Instead, she remained frozen in place, her thin body trembling, not just from the cold, but from something deep: fear, uncertainty, the kind of damage that comes from being let down too many times. Robert moved slowly toward her, each step careful and deliberate, as if approaching a wounded animal that might bolt at any sudden movement. When he finally reached her and gently pulled her into his arms, she felt as fragile as a bird. Her ribs were clearly visible through the thin fabric of her oversized shirt. "Are you real?" she asked, her small hands touching his face with fingers so cold they felt like ice. "I dream about you sometimes, but you always go away when I wake up." The innocence in that question, mixed with the resignation that even a 9-year-old shouldn't possess, shattered something inside Robert that he didn't know could break any further. "Real, sweetheart. I'm here, and I'm never leaving you again. Never." As they held each other in that frozen moment, Robert's mind raced with questions that threatened to overwhelm him. How long had she been living like this? How had no one noticed? What other horrors had she endured while he sat helpless in his cell, wrongfully convicted of a crime he didn't commit? But all of those concerns faded as he felt his daughter's thin arms wrap around his neck with the strength that surprised him. Despite everything she'd been through, despite the years of abandonment and neglect, she still remembered how to hold on to love. "I missed you so much, Daddy," she whispered against his shoulder. "Madia said you might never come back, that you forgot about me. But I knew she was lying. I knew you would come for me." Those words hit Robert like physical blows. Maria, Isabella's sister, the woman who had sworn to care for Sophia while he was away, the woman who had painted herself as a loving guardian in court, who had convinced the judge that she would provide the stable home that a convicted felon couldn't offer. Robert pulled back just enough to look into his daughter's eyes, seeing in them a mixture of hope and fear that no child should ever have to carry. "Listen to me, Sophia. Listen carefully." His voice was steady now, filled with the determination that had kept him alive for 4 years of hell. I never forgot about you. Not for 1 second. Every day, every hour, every breath I took was about getting back to you. And now that I'm here, nothing, and I mean nothing, is going to separate us again." A sound outside made them both freeze. Voices approaching the barn. Through a gap in the wall, Robert could see 2 figures walking toward the main house, Maria and her husband Carlos, returning from whatever errands had kept them away while their prisoners suffered alone in this frozen wasteland they called shelter. Robert helped Sophia gather her few possessions, some worn clothes that clearly never been washed properly, a stuffed elephant he'd given her for her 4th birthday that now looked like it had been through a war, and a small box that made his heart skip when he recognized what it contained. Letters. His letters. Dozens of them, written on prison stationery and sent with desperate hope over the past 4 years. Letters that had apparently reached Sophia, but which she had never been allowed to answer. Some were opened, their contents obviously read by adult eyes before being passed down to a child, who probably struggled to understand the big words her father used to tell her how much he loved her. "You kept them," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I read them every night before bed. Even the parts I didn't understand. It made me feel like you were still here, like you were telling me stories like you used to." The innocence of that statement, the image of his daughter reading his desperate pleas for news about her well-being as bedtime stories, nearly broke his composure entirely. But he forced himself to stay focused. There would be time for grief later. Right now, he needed to get his daughter out of this place and into safety. "Come on, baby. We're going to go talk to Maria and Carlos now. And then we're going home." "Home?" Sophia's eyes widened with something that might have been hope. "Do we have a home, Daddy?" The question revealed so much about what her life had been like. She didn't even remember having a real home, a place where she belonged, where she was wanted and loved and protected. "We will," Robert promised, taking her hand in his. "We're going to have the best home in the world, just you and me." Together, they walked across the yard toward the house where Sophia should have been living all along. With each step, Robert felt his anger building, not the wild, destructive rage that would only make things worse, but the cold, calculating fury of a man who had learned patience in the hardest school imaginable. The front door opened before they reached it. Maria Santos stood in the doorway, her face cycling through emotions so quickly that Robert could read her thoughts as clearly as if she were speaking them aloud. Shock at seeing him, fear at being caught, and then, most disgusting of all, defiance as she prepared to justify the unjustifiable. "Robert?" Her voice was carefully controlled, but he could see the panic in her eyes. "You're early. We weren't expecting you for another month. Early parole for good behavior," Robert replied, his tone deceptively. "Funny thing about being innocent, it makes you a model prisoner." Carlos appeared behind his wife, a large man whose bulk had always been used to intimidate rather than protect. But Robert had learned a few things about intimidation during his time inside, and he wasn't the same man who had been led away in shackles 4 years ago. "Now, Robert, before you get upset," Maria began. "Upset?" Robert's voice remained steady, but there was steel beneath the surface. "My daughter is living in a barn like an animal while you collect state benefits for her care? My daughter hasn't seen the inside of a school in years while you tell the authorities she's being homeschooled? My daughter is wearing rags and working like a servant while your own children sleep in warm beds and eat regular meals. Why on earth would I be upset about that?" Maria's face flushed red. "You have no right to judge us. We took her in when no one else would. We gave her a roof over her head and food to eat. Do you have any idea what it cost us to—" "Stop!" The word came out quiet, but with such authority that Maria's mouth snapped shut. "Don't you dare try to make yourself the victim here. Don't you dare pretend that what you've done to my daughter is anything less than criminal." "Criminal?" Carlos stepped forward, puffing out his chest. "Who are you to talk about criminal? You're the one who killed a man. You're the one who went to prison and left your kid with nothing." Robert felt Sophia's hand tighten in his, felt her small body press closer to his side. The fear radiating from her was palpable. Not fear of him, but fear of the people who had been her guardians for 4 years. "We saved her." Maria's voice rose to a shrill pitch. "We took her in when you couldn't. We fed her and clothed her and gave her shelter." "In a barn?" "She preferred the privacy. She was always a difficult child, antisocial, ungrateful for everything we did for her. Ask anyone in town, they'll tell you how hard we tried with her."
Robert looked down at Sophia, seeing the way she flinched at our aunt's words. This wasn't the first time she'd heard herself described as difficult, ungrateful, a burden. This was a child who had been systematically broken down, convinced that she deserved the treatment she received. "Is that what you told yourself?" Robert asked quietly. "That she was difficult? That she deserved to live like an animal? That a 5-year-old child who had just lost her father was somehow responsible for your decision to treat her like dirt?" "She wasn't 5 when we moved into the barn," Carlos said, as if that made it better. "She was 7, old enough to understand that actions have consequences." "What actions? What actions could a 7-year-old possibly take that would justify locking her away like an animal?" The silence that followed was damning in itself. Maria and Carlos exchanged glances, both realizing that they had revealed more than they intended. It was Sophia who finally spoke, her voice so small that Robert had to strain to hear her. "I asked about you on my birthday. I asked why you couldn't come to my party, and Aunt Maria got really mad. She said if I kept talking about you, I would have to find somewhere else to live." Robert felt his heart stop. His daughter had been punished for missing him. She had been exiled to a barn for the crime of loving her father. "And when did this start?" Robert asked, though he was no longer really speaking to Maria and Carlos. His attention was focused entirely on Sophia now. "When I was 6, she said, looking up at him with eyes that held too much pain for someone so young. "At first it was just for a few days when I was bad, but then it was all the time. 3 years. His daughter had been living in that barn for 3 years, from the age of 6 to 9. The most crucial years of her childhood stolen and replaced with cold, hunger, and isolation."
Robert closed his eyes for a moment, struggling to maintain his composure. When he opened them again, his gaze fell on a car pulling into the driveway. A neighbor, drawn by the raised voices, was approaching to see what the commotion was about. Mrs. Henderson had lived next door to the Santos family for 15 years. She was the kind of woman who knew everyone's business and wasn't shy about sharing her opinions. Robert remembered her from before his arrest, a kind woman who had always been friendly to him and Sophia. "Robert Castellanos?" She stepped out of her car, her face showing genuine surprise. "I thought, we heard you wouldn't be getting out for years yet." "New evidence proved my innocence," Robert replied, his tone warming slightly for the neighbor who had never done anything but treat him and Sophia with respect. "I was released this morning." Mrs. Henderson's eyes moved from Robert to Sophia, and he watched as her expression changed from confusion to concern to horrified understanding. She had always been a sharp woman, quick to pick up on details that others missed. "Sophia, honey, are you all right? You look—" The word she didn't finish hung in the air between them. Sophia looked thin, malnourished, neglected. She looked like a child who hadn't been properly cared for in years. "She's fine," Maria said quickly, but her voice lacked conviction. "She's just been sick lately. Kids, you know how they are." But Mrs. Henderson wasn't buying it. Robert could see the wheels turning in her mind as she took in the scene. Sophia clinging to her father's hand, the defensive postures of Maria and Carlos, the tension in the air that spoke of secrets being exposed. "Where has she been living?" Mrs. Henderson asked directly. The question was simple, but it might as well have been a death sentence for Maria's carefully constructed lies. Robert watched as Maria's sister-in-law's face went through another series of expressions, finally settling on trapped desperation. In the house, of course. Where else would she be living? But Mrs. Henderson's sharp eyes had already noticed the smoke coming from the barn chimney, the path worn in the grass between the main house and the old building, the guilty expressions on Maria and Carlos's faces. "I think," Mrs. Henderson said slowly, "that I should call someone about this." "That won't be necessary," Robert said, pulling out a cell phone he'd bought at the bus station with the last of his money. "I'm already making that call."
The next hour passed in a blur of activity that would have been overwhelming if Robert hadn't been focused entirely on his daughter's well-being. Child Protective Services arrived with a speed that suggested Mrs. Henderson had made some of her own calls. A social worker named Janet Pierce took one look at the barn where Sophia had been living and immediately called for backup. Within minutes, the Santos property was swarming with professionals, social workers, police officers, a photographer to document the conditions, and a paramedic to check Sophia's health. Robert watched as each new arrival's face went through the same transformation, professional composure melting into barely controlled outrage as they saw what had been done to a child in the name of care. The barn was photographed from every angle, the thin blankets, The inadequate heating, the gaps in the walls that let in wind and rain, the complete lack of proper sanitation. Janet Pierce made notes with the grim efficiency of someone who had seen too much, but never quite enough to become numb to it. "How long has the child been living in these conditions?" she asked Maria, her voice professionally neutral, but her eyes blazing with anger. "It's not as bad as it looks," Maria protested. "She had blankets, she had heat when she needed it. We checked on her every day." "Every day?" Robert couldn't keep the sarcasm out of his voice. "Is that why she's thin enough that I can count her ribs through her shirt?"
The paramedic's examination of Sophia was gentle but thorough. She was underweight, showing signs of chronic malnutrition and vitamin deficiency. Her hands bore calluses from manual labor that no 9-year-old should be doing. But perhaps most telling was her behavior. The way she flinched from sudden movements, the way she asked permission before speaking, the way she seemed to expect punishment for existing. "Mr. Castellanos," Janet Pierce approached Robert while Sophia was being examined, "I need to understand your situation. You were released from prison today?" "This morning. My conviction was overturned when new evidence proved my innocence. DNA evidence identified the real killer." Robert handed her a folder of legal documents he'd been carrying. "Everything's in there. The exoneration, the settlement agreement, the court order restoring my parental rights." Janet reviewed the documents quickly, her expression becoming more hopeful with each page. "This is quite comprehensive. The court has already ruled on custody?" "Emergency hearing yesterday. I have full legal and physical custody effective immediately upon my release." As if to underscore the timing of it all, another car pulled into the already crowded driveway. Robert's attorney, David Kim, emerged carrying a briefcase and wearing the satisfied expression of a man who had just won the biggest case of his career. "Robert," David approached with a grin that faded as he took in the scene around them, "I came to congratulate you on your freedom, but it looks like we have other business to handle." "David, meet my daughter's living conditions for the past 4 years," Robert said grimly, gesturing toward the barn. David Kim had been the pro bono attorney who had taken Robert's case when it seemed hopeless. A young lawyer from Legal Aid who believed in justice even when the system failed, he had worked tirelessly to prove Robert's innocence. Seeing the conditions that had motivated his client's desperation added a personal dimension to what had already been a crusade for justice. "Oh my," David muttered, then caught himself and glanced apologetically at Sophia. "Sorry, sweetheart." But Sophia barely noticed the mild profanity. She was still processing the fact that all these adults were here because of her, because someone finally cared about how she was living. The concept was so foreign that she seemed almost stunned by it. "Are they going to take me away again?" she asked her father in a small voice. The question broke Robert's heart all over again. His daughter had been moved so many times, disappointed so many times, that she couldn't believe this might actually be the end of her suffering. "No one is taking you anywhere except with me," Robert assured her, kneeling down to her level. "These people are here to help us, to make sure that what happened to you never happens to any other kid." Janet Pierce had been listening to this exchange, and Robert could see the wheels turning in her head. She was balancing the welfare of the child against the practicalities of the situation. A father just released from prison, with no home and no job, wanting to take custody of a traumatized 9-year-old. "Mr. Castellanos, while your legal rights are clear, I have to ask about your current living situation. Do you have housing arranged, income, support systems for Sophia's recovery?" Robert felt a moment of panic. He had been so focused on proving his innocence and getting back to his daughter that he hadn't fully considered the practical challenges of starting over with nothing. It was David Kim who came to his rescue. "Actually, that's part of why I'm here. The settlement from the wrongful conviction came through this morning. It's substantial, enough to provide housing, medical care, therapy, education, and living expenses while Robert gets back on his feet." He handed Janet another set of documents. "We have also arranged for temporary housing in a family facility that specializes in reunification cases. Robert and Sophia will have support from social workers and therapists who understand the unique challenges they're facing." Robert felt a surge of gratitude toward the young lawyer who believed in him when no one else would. David had thought of everything, planned for contingencies that Robert's desperate focus hadn't allowed him to consider. "And the Santos family?" Janet asked, though the answer was already clear from the activity around them. "Will be facing charges for child endangerment, neglect, and fraud," David replied grimly. "Collecting state benefits for care they weren't providing is just the beginning. We'll be pursuing both criminal charges and a civil suit." Maria, who had been listening to this conversation with growing alarm, finally exploded. "This is ridiculous! We gave her everything we could afford. We're not rich people. We couldn't give her the kind of luxury she was used to with him." She pointed at Robert with an accusatory finger, as if his imprisonment had somehow been a choice rather than the result of a justice system that had failed catastrophically. "Luxury." Robert's voice was dangerously quiet. "You think basic human decency is luxury. You think a warm bed and regular meals and the chance to go to school are luxuries? She had meals. She had a place to sleep. In a barn, like an animal. She was difficult. She wouldn't follow rules, wouldn't do her chores without complaining. She needed to learn discipline." Robert looked at his daughter, really looked at her, and saw a child who had learned to be invisible, to take up as little space as possible, to never ask for anything. This wasn't a difficult child. This was a child who had been systematically broken down until she no longer believed she deserved basic care. "What rules?" Robert asked quietly. "What rules could a 6-year-old break that would justify locking her in a barn?" The silence that followed was damning. Maria and Carlos both knew they had no answer that would sound reasonable to the assembled professionals, no justification that would make their actions appear as anything other than cruel abuse of a vulnerable child. It was Officer Martinez who finally broke the silence. "Maria Santos, Carlos Santos, you're under arrest for child endangerment, neglect, and welfare fraud." The rest of the afternoon passed in a haze of administrative details and emotional reunions. Robert found himself reliving moments he had dreamed about for 4 years, but under circumstances he had never imagined. This wasn't the joyful homecoming he envisioned. This was a rescue mission, a salvage operation to recover what remained of his daughter's childhood. But as the sun began to set and the last of the officials packed up their equipment, Robert found himself alone with Sophia for the first time in 4 years. They sat together on the steps of David Kim's car, waiting for their ride to the temporary housing facility that would be their first real home together. "Daddy?" Sophia's voice was still so small, as if she was afraid that speaking too loudly might make this all disappear. "Yes, baby? Are you really going to stay with me this time?" The question hit him like a physical blow. His daughter had learned not to trust promises, not to believe in permanence. She had been abandoned so many times that even her father's return couldn't overcome her fear of being left alone again. "Sophia, look at me." Robert waited until her eyes met his before continuing. "I know it's hard to believe after everything that's happened. I know you've been disappointed and hurt and left alone when you needed someone most. But I need you to understand something, and I need you to believe it, even when it's hard." She nodded solemnly, giving him her full attention in a way that reminded him of the little girl she had been before the world taught her to expect disappointment. "The only reason I wasn't with you these past 4 years is because they locked me in a cage and wouldn't let me out. Every single day, every single hour, every single minute I was away from you was because someone else made that choice for us. It was never my choice. It was never because I didn't want to be with you." Tears were streaming down both their faces now, but Robert pressed on. "And now that I'm free, now that we're together, nothing and no one will ever separate us again. Not the police, not the courts, not your aunt, not anyone. We're a family, Sophia, just you and me. And families stick together." Sophia threw her arms around his neck with a strength that surprised him, holding on as if he might disappear if she let go. "I love you, Daddy. I never stopped loving you, even when Aunt Maria said I should forget about you. I love you too, baby girl, more than all the stars in the sky and all the fish in the sea and all the grains of sand on every beach in the world." It was an old game they used to play when she was small, trying to quantify their love in impossibly large terms. The fact that she remembered it, that she smiled for the first time all day when he said it, gave Robert hope that the little girl he had lost was still there, hidden beneath the layers of trauma and fear. The next few months would be challenging in ways that Robert was only beginning to understand. Sophia's trauma would manifest in nightmares, anxiety attacks, and behavioral issues that would test both their patience and their bond. She would struggle with trust, with attachment, with the simple concept that she deserved love and care.
There would be therapy sessions where she had to relive the worst moments of her life. There would be legal proceedings where she had to testify against the people who had abused her. There would be educational assessments revealing just how far behind she had fallen and the monumental task of helping her catch up academically while also healing emotionally. Robert would have his own healing to do. 4 years of wrongful imprisonment had left him with anger, trust issues, and the practical challenge of rebuilding a life that had been completely destroyed. He would have to learn to be a father again to a daughter who was no longer the child he remembered, while dealing with his own trauma and rage at the system that had failed them both. But as they sat together on those steps, watching the sun set on the worst day of their lives, there was also somehow the first day of their new beginning. Robert felt something he hadn't experienced in 4 years. Hope. His daughter was alive. She was with him. She was safe. Everything else they would figure out together. The settlement from his wrongful conviction would provide them with resources that most families in their situation could never dream of. Good housing, excellent medical care, the best therapists money could buy, and the financial security to focus on healing rather than survival. But more importantly, they had each other. The bond between them had been tested by 4 years of separation, by systematic attempts to make Sophia forget her father, by trauma that would have broken weaker connections. Yet here they were, still a family, still capable of love, still believing that tomorrow could be better than today. The little girl who had survived 4 years of neglect and abuse had somehow managed to hold on to her capacity for joy, for trust, for the kind of fierce love that made everything worthwhile. And the man who had never stopped fighting for his freedom and his right to be her father had proven that some bonds truly are unbreakable. Justice had been served in the courtroom, but the real victory was happening right here on these steps. A father and daughter, reunited against all odds, facing an uncertain future with the one thing that mattered most, each other. Have you ever had to fight for something you believed in so deeply that you refused to give up even when everyone else said it was hopeless? Sometimes the most important victories aren't the ones that make headlines. They're the quiet moments, when love wins over fear, when hope defeats despair, when a family finds its way back together despite everything the world has thrown at them. This is what real strength looks like. Not the absence of pain, but the decision to keep loving through it. Not the avoidance of hardship, but the determination to build something beautiful from the broken pieces. And sometimes, when we're lucky enough to witness it, we remember that the most powerful force in the universe isn't justice or revenge or even righteous anger. It's a father's love for his daughter and her belief that he would never stop coming for her. That's a bond that can survive anything, even 4 years in hell. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of the power of never giving up on the people you love, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because somewhere out there, another father is fighting for his child, another child is waiting for someone to come for them, and another family is one decision away from finding their way back to each other. Love never gives up, and neither should we. Please don't just watch and walk away. Hit that subscribe button and join our Everbell Stories family.